Section 24 of Captain Singleton. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. The Life, Adventures, and Piracies of the Famous Captain Singleton by Daniel Defoe. Section 24. I have reason to believe that upon the sight they immediately sent an account of a ship being there, and of the condition we were in, for the next day there appeared a great man. Whether it was their king or no, I know not. But he had abundance of men with him, and some with long javelins in their hands, as long as half-pikes, and these came all down to the water's edge, and drew up in a very good order, just in our view. They stood near an hour without making any motion, and then there came near 20 of them, with a man before them carrying a white flag. They came forward in the water as high as their waists, the sea not going so high as before, for the wind was abated, and blew off the shore. The man made a long oration to us, as we could see by his gestures, and we sometimes heard his voice, but knew not one word he said. William, who was always useful to us, I believe was here again, the saving of all our lives. The case was this: the fellow, or what I might call him, when his speech was done, gave 3 great screams, for I know not what else to say they were, then lowered his white flag 3 times, and then made 3 motions to us with his arm to come to him. I acknowledge that I was for manning out the boat and going to them, but William would by no means allow me. He told me we ought to trust nobody, that if they were barbarians and under their own government, we might sure to be all murdered, and if they were Christians, we should not fare much better, if they knew who we were, that it was the custom of the Malabars to betray all people that they could get into their hands, and that these were some of the same people, and that if we had any regard to our own safety, we should not go to them by any means. I opposed him a great while, and told him I thought he used to be always right, but that now I thought he was not, that I was no more for running needless risks than he or any one else, but I thought all the nations in the world, even the most savage people, when they held out a flag of peace, kept the offer of peace made by that signal very sacredly, and I gave him several examples of it in the history of my African travels, which I have here gone through in the beginning of this work, and that I could not think these people worse than some of them. And besides, I told him, our case seemed to be such that we must fall into somebody's hands or other, and that we had better fall into their hands by a friendly treaty than by a forced submission, nay, though they had indeed a treacherous design, and therefore I was for a parley with them. "Well, friend," says William very gravely, "if thou wilt go, I cannot help it. I shall only desire to take my one last leave of thee at parting, for, depend upon it, thou wilt never see us again. Whether we in the ship may come off any better at last, I cannot resolve thee, but this I will answer for, that we will not give up our lives idly, and in cool blood, as thou art going to do. We will at least preserve ourselves as long as we can, and die at last like men, not like fools trepanned by the wiles of a few barbarians." William spoke this with so much warmth, and yet with so much assurance of our fate, that I began to think a little of the risk I was going to run. I had no more mind to be murdered than he, and yet I could not for my life be so faint-hearted in the thing as he. Upon which I asked him if he had any knowledge of the place, or had ever been there. He said no. Then I asked him if he had heard or read anything about the people of this island, and of their way of treating any Christians that had fallen into their hands, and he told me he had heard of one, and he would tell me the story afterward. His name, he said, was Knox, commander of an East India ship, who was driven on shore, just as we were, upon his island of Ceylon, though he could not say it was at the same place, or whereabouts, that he was beguiled by the barbarians, and enticed to come on shore, just as we were invited to do at that time, and that, when they had him, they surrounded him and 18 or 20 of his men, and never suffered them to return, but kept them prisoners, or murdered them, he could not tell which, but they were carried away up into the country, separated from one another, and never heard of afterwards, except the captain's son, who miraculously made his escape after 20 years' slavery. I had no time then to ask him to give the full story of this Knox, much less to hear him tell it me, but as it is usual in such cases, when one begins to be a little touched, I turned short with him. "Why then, friend William," said I, "what would you have us do? You see what condition we are in, and what is before us, and something must be done, and that immediately." "Why," says William, "I'll tell thee what thou shalt do. First, cause a white flag to be hanged out, as they do to us, and man out the longboat and pinnace with as many men as they can well stow, to handle their arms, and let me go with them, and thou shalt see what we will do. If I miscarry, thou mayst be safe, and I will also tell thee that if I do miscarry, it shall be my own fault, and thou shalt learn wit by my folly." I knew not what to reply to him at first, but after some pause I said, "William, I am as both you should be lost as you are that I should, and if there be any danger, I desire you may no more fall into it than I. Therefore, if you will, let us all keep in the ship and fare alike, and take our fate together." "No, no," says William, "there's no danger in the method I propose. Thou shalt go with me if thou thinkest fit, if thou pleasest, but to follow the measures that I shall resolve on, depend upon it, though we will go off from the ships, we will not a man of us go any nearer them than within call to talk with them. Thou seest they have no boats to come off to us, but," says he, "I rather desire thou wouldst take my advice and manage the ships, as I shall give the signal from the boat, and let us concert that matter together before we go off." Well, I found William had his measures in his head all laid beforehand, and was not at a loss what to do at all. So I told him he should be captain for this voyage, and we would be all of us under his orders, which I would see observed to a tittle. Upon this conclusion of our debates, he ordered 24 men into the longboat, and 12 men into the pinnace, and the sea being now pretty smooth, they went off, being all very well armed. Also he ordered that all the guns of the great ship, on the side which lay next the shore, should be loaded with musket balls, old nails, stubs, and such like pieces of old iron, lead, and anything that came to hand, and that we should prepare to fire as soon as ever we saw them lower the white flag and hoist up a red one in the pinnace. With these measures fixed between us, they went off towards the shore, William in the pinnace with 12 men, and the long-boat coming after him with 24 more, all stout, resolute fellows, and very well armed. They rowed so near the shore as that they might speak to one another, carrying a white flag as the other did, and offering a parley. The brutes, for such they were, showed themselves very courteous, but finding we could not understand them, they fetched an old Dutchman, who had been their prisoner many years, and set him to speak with us. The sum and substance of his speech was, that the king of the country had sent his general down to know who we were, and what our business was. William stood up in the stern of the pinnace, and told him, that as to that, he, that was an European, by his language and voice, might easily know what we were, and our condition. The ship being aground upon the sand, would also tell him that our business was that of a ship in distress. So William desired to know what they came down for with such a multitude, and with arms and weapons, as if they came to war with us. He answered, they might have very good reason to come down to the shore, the country being alarmed with the appearance of ships of strangers upon the coast, and as our vessels were full of men, and as we had guns and weapons, the king had sent part of his military men, that in case of any invasion upon the country, they might be ready to defend themselves, whatsoever might be the occasion. But, says he, as you are men in distress, the king has ordered his general, who is here also, to give you all the assistance he can, and to invite you on shore, and receive you with all possible courtesy. Says William, very quick upon him, before I give thee an answer to that, I desire thee to tell me what thou art, for by thy speech thou art an European. He answered presently, he was a Dutchman. That I know well, says William, by thy speech, but art thou a native Dutchman of Holland, or a native of this country that has learned Dutch by conversing among the Hollanders, who we know are settled upon this island? No, says the old man, I am a native of Delft, in the province of Holland, in Europe. Well, says William, immediately. But art thou a Christian, or a heathen, or what we call a renegado? I am, says he, a Christian. And they went on in a short dialogue as follows. William, thou art a Dutchman and a Christian, thou sayest. Pray, art thou a free man or a servant? Dutchman, I am a servant to the king here, and in his army. W. But art thou a volunteer or a prisoner? D. Indeed, I was a prisoner at first, but am at liberty now, and so am a volunteer. W. That is to say, being first a prisoner, thou hast liberty to serve them, but art thou so at liberty that thou mayst go away, if thou pleasest, to thine own countrymen? D. No, I do not say so. My countrymen live a great way off, on the north and east parts of the island, and there is no going to them without the king's express license. W. Well, and Why dost thou not get a license to go away? D. I have never asked for it. W. And I suppose if thou didst, thou knowest thou couldst not obtain it. D. I cannot say much as to that, but why do you ask me all these questions? W. Why, my reason is good. If thou art a Christian and a prisoner, how canst thou consent to be made an instrument to these barbarians, to betray us into their hands, who are thy countrymen and fellow Christians? Is it not a barbarous thing in thee to do so? D. How do I go about to betray you? Do I not give you an account how the king invites you to come on shore, and has ordered you to be treated courteously and assisted? W. As thou art a Christian, though I doubt it much, dost thou believe the king, or the general, as thou callest it, means one word of what he says? D. He promises you by the mouth of his great general. W. I don't ask thee what he promises, or by whom, but I ask thee this: canst thou say that thou believest he intends to perform it? D. How can I answer that? How can I tell what he intends? W. Thou canst tell me what thou believest. D. I cannot say, but he will perform it. I believe he may. W. Thou art but a double-tongued Christian, I doubt. Come, I'll ask thee another question. Wilt thou say that thou believest it, and that thou wouldst advise me to believe it, and put our lives into their hands upon these promises? D. I am not to be your adviser. W. Thou art perhaps afraid to speak thy mind, because thou art in their power. Pray, do any of them understand what thou and I say? Can they speak Dutch? D. No, not one of them. I have no apprehensions upon that account at all. W. Why, then answer me plainly, if thou art a Christian. Is it safe for us to venture upon their words, to put ourselves into their hands, and come on shore? D. You put it very home to me. Pray let me ask you another question. Are you in any likelihood of getting your ship off, if you refuse it? W. Yes, we shall get off the ship. Now the storm is over, we don't fear it. D. Then I cannot say it is best for you to trust them. W. Well, it is honestly said. D. But what shall I say to them? W. Give them good words, as they give us. D. What good words? W. Why, let them tell the king that we are strangers, who were driven on his coast by a great storm, that we thank him very kindly for his offer of civility to us, which, if we are further distressed, we will accept thankfully, but that at present we have no occasion to come on shore, and besides that we cannot safely leave the ship in the present condition she is in, but that we are obliged to take care of her in order to get her off, and expect in a tide or two more to get her quite clear and at an anchor. D. But he will expect you to come on shore then, to visit him and make him some present for his civility. W. When we have got our ship clear and stopped the leaks, we will pay our respects to him. D. Nay, you may as well come to him now as then. W. Nay, hold, friend. I did not say we would come to him then. You talked of making him a present, that is, to pay our respects to him, is it not? D. Well, but I will tell him that you will come on shore to him when your ship is got off. W. I have nothing to say to that, and you may tell him what you think fit. D. But he will be in a great rage if I do not. W. Who will he be in a great rage at? D. At you. W. What occasion have we to value that? D. Why, he will send all his army down against you. W. And what if they were all here just now? What dost thou suppose they could do to us? D. He would expect they should burn your ships and bring you all to him. W. Tell him, if he should try, he may catch a Tartar. D. He has a world of men. W. Has he any ships? D. No, he has no ships. W. Nor boats? D. No, nor boats. W. Why, what then do you think we care for his men? What canst thou do now to us, if thou hadst 100,000 with thee? D. Oh, they might set you on fire. W. Set us a-firing, thou meanest. That they might indeed, but set us on fire they shall not. They may try at their peril, and we shall make mad work with your 100,000 men, if they come within reach of our guns, I assure thee. D. But what if the king gives you hostages for your safety? W. Whom can he give but mere slaves and servants like thyself, whose lives he no more values than we an English hound? D. Whom do you demand for hostages? W. Himself and your worship. D. What would you do with him? W. Do with him as he would do with us. Cut his head off. D. And what would you do with me? W. Do with thee? We would carry thee home into thine own country, and though thou deservest the gallows, we would make a man and a Christian of thee again, and not do by thee as thou wouldst have done by us, betray thee to a parcel of merciless, savage pagans, that know no God, nor how to show mercy to man. D. You put a thought in my head that I will speak to you about tomorrow. Thus they went away, and William came on board and gave us a full account of his parley with the old Dutchman, which was very diverting, and to me instructing, for I had abundance of reason to acknowledge William had made a better judgment of things than I. It was our good fortune to get our ship off that very night, and to bring her to an anchor about 1.5 miles further out, and in deep water, to our great satisfaction, so that we had no need to fear the Dutchman's king, with his 100,000 men, and indeed we had some sport with them the next day when they came down. A vast, prodigious multitude of them, very few less in number, in our imagination, than 100,000, with some elephants, though if it had been an army of elephants, they could have done us no harm, for we were fairly at our anchor now, and out of their reach. And indeed, we thought ourselves more out of their reach than we really were, and it was 10,000 to 1 that we had not been fast aground again, for the wind, blowing off shore, though it made the water smooth where we lay, yet it blew the ebb farther out than usual, and we could easily perceive the sand, which we touched upon before, lay in the shape of a half-moon, and surrounded us with 2 horns of it, so that we lay in the middle or centre of it, as in a round bay, safe, just as we were, and in deep water, but present death, as it were, on the right hand and on the left, for the two horns or points of the sand reached out beyond where our ship lay, near 2 miles. On that part of the sand which lay on our east side, this misguided multitude extended themselves, and being, most of them, not above their knees, or most of them not above ankle deep in the water, they, as it were, surrounded us on that side, and on the side of the mainland, and a little way on the other side of the sand, standing in a half circle, or rather 3/5 of a circle, for about 6 miles in length. The other horn or point of the sand which lay on our west side, being not quite so shallow, they could not extend themselves upon it so far. They little thought what service they had done us, and how unwittingly, and by the greatest ignorance, they had made themselves pilots to us, while we, having not sounded the place, might have been lost before we were aware. It is true we might have sounded our new harbour before we had ventured out, but I cannot say for certain whether we should or not, for I, for my part, had not the least suspicion of what our real case was. However, I say, perhaps, before we had weighed, we should have looked about us a little. I am sure we ought to have done it, for besides these armies of human furies, we had a very leaky ship, and all our pumps could hardly keep the water from growing upon us, and our carpenters were overboard, working to find out and stop the wounds we had received, healing her first on the one side and then on the other, and it was very diverting to see how, when our men heeled the ship over to the side next the wild army that stood on the east horn of the sand, they were so amazed, between fright and joy, that it put them into a kind of confusion, calling to one another, hallooing and squeaking, in a manner that it is impossible to describe. While we were doing this, for we were in a great hurry, you may be sure, and all hands at work, as well at the stopping our leaks as repairing our rigging and sails, which had received a great deal of damage, and also in rigging a new main topmast, and the like. I say, while we were doing all this, we perceived a body of men, of near 1,000, move from that part of the army of the barbarians that lay at the bottom of the sandy bay, and came all along the water's edge, round the sand, till they stood just on our broadside east, and were within 1/2 mile of us. Then we saw the Dutchman come forward nearer to us, and all alone, with his white flag and all his motions, just as before. And there he stood. End of section 24. Read by Dennis Sayers in Modesto, California, for LibriVox. Section 25 of Captain Singleton. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. The Life, Adventures, and Piracies of the Famous Captain Singleton by Daniel Defoe. Section 25. Our men had but just brought the ship to rights again as they came up to our broadside, and we had very happily found out and stopped the worst and most dangerous leak that we had, to our very great satisfaction. So I ordered the boats to be hauled up and manned as they were the day before, and William to go as plenipotentiary. I would have gone myself if I had understood Dutch, but as I did not, it was to no purpose, for I should be able to know nothing of what was said but from him at second hand, which might be done as well afterwards. All the instructions I pretended to give William was, if possible, to get the old Dutchman away, and, if he could, to make him come on board. Well, William went just as before, and when he came within about 60 or 70 yards of the shore, he held up his white flag as the Dutchman did, and turning the boats broadside to the shore, and his men lying upon their oars, the parley, or dialogue, began again thus: William: Well, friend, what dost thou say to us now? Dutchman: I come of the same mild errand as I did yesterday. W. What? Dost thou pretend to come of a mild errand, with all these people at thy back, and all the foolish weapons of war they bring with them? Prithee, what dost thou mean? D. The king hastens us to invite the captain and all his men to come on shore, and has ordered all his men to show them all the civility they can. W. Well, and are all those men come to invite us ashore? D. They will do you no hurt if you will come on shore peaceably. W. Well, and what dost thou think they can do to us if we will not? D. I would not have them do any hurt then neither. W. But prithee, friend, do not make thyself fool and knave too. Dost not thou know that we are out of fear of all thy army, and out of danger of all that they can do? What makes thee act so simply, as well as so knavishly? D. Why, you may think yourselves safer than you are. You do not know what they may do to you. I can assure you they are able to do you a great deal of harm, and perhaps burn your ship. W. Suppose that were true, as I am sure it is false. You see, we have more ships to carry us off, pointing to the sloop. Note bene. Just at this time we discovered the sloop standing towards us from the east, along the shore, at about the distance of 2 leagues, which was to our particular satisfaction, she having been missing 13 days. D. We do not value that. If you had 10 ships, you dare not come on shore with all the men you have, in a hostile way. We are too many for you. W. Thou dost not, even in that, speak as thou meanest, and we may give thee a trial of our hands, when our friends come up to us, for thou hearest they have discovered us. Just then the sloop fired 5 guns, which was to get news of us, for they did not see us. D. Yes, I hear they fire. But I hope your ship will not fire again, for if they do, our general will take it for breaking the truce, and will make the army let fly a shower of arrows at you in the boat. W. Thou mayst be sure the ship will fire, that the other ship may hear them, but not with ball. If thy general knows no better, he may begin when he will, but thou mayest be sure we will return it to his cost. D. What must I do then? W. Do? Why, go to him, and tell him of it beforehand, then, and let him know that the ship firing is not at him nor his men, and then come again, and tell us what he says. D. No, I will send to him, which will do as well. W. Do as thou wilt, but I believe thou hadst better go thyself, For if our men fire first, I suppose he will be in a great wrath, and it may be at thee. For as to his wrath at us, we tell thee beforehand we value it not. D. You slight them too much. You know not what they may do. W. Thou makest as if these poor savage wretches could do mighty things. Prithee, let us see what you can all do. We value it not. Thou mayst set down thy flag of truce when thou pleasest, and begin. D. I had rather make a truce, and have you all part friends. W. Thou art a deceitful rogue thyself, for it is plain thou knowest these people would only persuade us on shore to entrap and surprise us, and yet thou that art a Christian, as thou callest thyself, would have us come on shore and put our lives into their hands, who know nothing that belongs to compassion, good usage, or good manners. How canst thou be such a villain? D. How do you call me so? What have I done to you, and what would you have me do? W. Not act like a traitor, but like one that was once a Christian, and would have been so still if you had not been a Dutchman. D. I know not what to do, not I. I wish I were from them. They are a bloody people. W. Prithee, make no difficulty of what thou shouldst do. Canst thou swim? D. Yes, I can swim, but if I should attempt to swim off to you, I should have 1,000 arrows and javelins sticking in me before I should get to your boat. W. I'll bring the boat close to thee, and take thee on board in spite of them all. We will give them but one volley, and I'll engage they will all run away from thee. D. You are mistaken in them, I assure you. They would immediately come all running down to the shore, and shoot fire arrows at you, and set your boat and ship and all on fire about your ears. W. We will venture that, if thou wilt come off. D. Will you use me honorably when I am among you? W. I'll give thee my word for it, if thou provest honest. D. Will you not make me a prisoner? W. I will be thy surety, body for body, that thou shalt be a free man, and go whither thou wilt, though I own to thee thou dost not deserve it. Just at this time our ship fired 3 guns to answer the sloop, and let her know we saw her, who immediately we perceived it, understood it, and stood directly for the place. But it is impossible to express the confusion and filthy, vile noise, the hurry and universal disorder that was among that vast multitude of people upon our firing off 3 guns. They immediately all repaired to their arms, as I may call it, for to say they put themselves into order would be saying nothing. Upon the word of command, then, they advanced all in a body to the seaside, and resolving to give us one volley of their firearms, for such they were, immediately they saluted us with 100,000 of their fire arrows, every one carrying a little bag of cloth dipped in brimstone, or some such thing, which, flying through the air, had nothing to hinder it taking fire as it flew, and it generally did so. I cannot say but this method of attacking us, by a way we had no notion of, might give us, at first, some little surprise, for the number was so great at first that we were not altogether without apprehensions that they might, unluckily set our ship on fire, so that William resolved immediately to row on board and persuade us all to weigh and stand out to sea. But there was no time for it, for they immediately let fly a volley at the boat and at the ship from all parts of the vast crowd of people which stood near the shore. Nor did they fire, as I may call it, all at once, and so leave off. But their arrows being soon notched upon their bows, they kept continually shooting, so that the air was full of flame. I could not say whether they set their cotton rag on fire before they shot the arrow, for I did not perceive they had fire with them, which, however, it seems they had. The arrow, besides the fire it carried with it, had a head, or a peg, as we call it, of bone, and some of sharp flint stone, and some few of a metal, too soft in itself for metal, but hard enough to cause it to enter if it were a plank, so as to stick where it fell. William and his men had notice sufficient to lie close behind their waste-boards, which, for this very purpose, they had made so high that they could easily sink themselves behind them, so as to defend themselves from anything that came point blank, as we call it, or upon a line. But for what might fall perpendicularly out of the air they had no guard, but took the hazard of that. At first they made as if they would row away, but before they went they gave a volley of their firearms, firing at those which stood with the Dutchman. But William ordered them to be sure to take their aim at others, so as to miss him, and they did so. There was no calling to them now, for the noise was so great among them that they could hear nobody, but our men boldly rowed in nearer to them, for they were at first driven a little off, and when they came nearer they fired a second volley, which put the fellows into great confusion, and we could see from the ship that several of them were killed or wounded. We thought this was a very unequal fight, and therefore we made a signal to our men to row away, that we might have a little of the sport as well as they. But the arrows flew so thick upon them, being so near the shore, that they could not sit to their oars, so they spread a little of their sail, thinking they might sail along the shore, and lie behind their waste-board. But the sail had not been spread 6 minutes, till it had 500 fire arrows shot into it and through it, and at length set it fairly on fire, nor were our men quite out of the danger of its setting the boat on fire, and this made them paddle and shove the boat away as well as they could, as they lay, to get farther off. By this time they had left us a fair mark at the whole savage army, and as we had steered the ship as near to them as we could, we fired among the thickest of them 6 or 7 times, 5 guns at a time, with shot, old iron, musket, bullets, etc. We could easily see that we made havoc among them, and killed and wounded abundance of them, and that they were in a great surprise at it, but yet they never offered to stir, and all this while their fire arrows flew as thick as before. At last, on a sudden, their arrows stopped, and the old Dutchman came running down to the waterside all alone, with his white flag, as before, waving it as high as he could, and making signals to our boat to come to him again. William did not care at first to go near him, but the man continuing to make signals to him to come, at last William went, and the Dutchman told him that he had been with the general, who was much mollified by the slaughter of his men, and that now he could have anything of him. "Anything?" says William. "What have we to do with him? let him go about his business, and carry his men out of gunshot, can't he? Why, says the Dutchman, but he dares not stir nor see the king's face, unless some of your men come on shore. He will certainly put him to death. Why then, says William, he is a dead man, for if it were to save his life and the lives of all the crowd that is with him, he shall never have one of us in his power. But I'll tell thee, said William, how thou shalt cheat him, and gain thy own liberty too. If thou hast any mind to see thy own country again, and art not turned savage, and grown fond of living all thy days among heathens and savages. I would be glad to do it with all my heart, says he, but if I should offer to swim off to you now, though they are so far from me, they shoot so true, that they would kill me before I got half-way. But, says William, I'll tell thee how thou shalt come with his consent. Go to him, and tell him I have offered to carry you on board, to try if you could persuade the captain to come on shore, and that I would not hinder him if he was willing to venture. The Dutchman seemed in a rapture at the very first word. I'll do it, says he. I am persuaded he will give me leave to come. Away he runs as if he had a glad message to carry, and tells the general that William had promised, if he would go on board the ship with him, he would persuade the captain to return with him. The general was fool enough to give him orders to go, and charged him not to come back without the captain, which he readily promised, and very honestly might. So they took him in, and brought him on board, and he was as good as his word to them, for he never went back to them any more. And the sloop being come to the mouth of the inlet where we lay, we weighed and set sail. But as we went out, being pretty near the shore, we fired 3 guns, as it were, among them, but without any shot, for it was of no use to us to hurt any more of them. After we had fired, we gave them a cheer, as the seamen call it, that is to say, we hallooed at them by way of triumph, and so carried off their ambassador. How it fared with their general, we know nothing of that. End of Section 26 of Captain Singleton. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to find out how to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Read by Dennis Sayers. The Life, Adventures, and Piracies of Captain Singleton by Daniel Defoe. Section 26. This passage, when I related it to a friend of mine after my return from those rambles, agreed so well with his relation of what happened to one Mr. Knox, an English captain, who some time ago was decoyed on shore by these people, that it could not but be very much to my satisfaction to think what mischief we had all escaped, and I think it cannot but be very profitable to record the other story, which is but short, with my own, to show whoever reads this what it was I avoided, and prevent their falling into the like, if you have to do with the perfidious people of Ceylon. The relation is as follows. The island of Ceylon, being inhabited for the greatest part by barbarians, which will not allow any trade or commerce with any European nation, and inaccessible by any travellers. It will be convenient to relate the occasion, how the author of this story happened to go into this island, and what opportunities he had of being fully acquainted with the people, their laws and customs, that so we may the better depend upon the account, and value it as it deserves, for the rarity as well as the truth of it. And both these the author gives us a brief relation of, in this manner. His words are as follows. In the year 1657, the Anne frigate of London, Captain Robert Knox, commander, on the 21st day of January, set sail out of the Downs, in the service of the Honourable East India Company of England, bound for Fort St. George, upon the coast of Coromandel, to trade for 1 year from port to port in India, which having performed, as he was lading his goods to return for England, being in the road of Masulipatam on the 19th of November, 1659, there happened such a mighty storm that in it several ships were cast away, and he was forced to cut his mainmast by the board, which so disabled the ship that he could not proceed in his voyage. Whereupon Cottiar, in the island of Ceylon, being a very commodious bay, fit for her present distress, Thomas Chambers, Esquire, since Sir Thomas Chambers, the agent at Fort St. George, ordered that the ship should take in some cloth, and India merchants belonging to Porto Novo, who might trade there while she lay to set her mast, and repair the other damages sustained by the storm. At her first coming thither, after the Indian merchants were set ashore, the captain and his men were very jealous of the people of that place, by reason the English never had any commerce or dealing with them. But after they had been there 20 days, going ashore and returning again at pleasure, without any molestation, they began to lay aside all suspicious thoughts of the people that dwelt thereabouts, who had kindly entertained them for their money. By this time the king of the country had notice of their arrival, and not being acquainted with their intents, he sent down a dissauva, or general, with an army to them, who immediately sent a messenger to the captain on board, to desire him to come ashore to him, pretending a letter from the king. The captain saluted the message with firing of guns, and ordered his son, Robert Knox, and Mr. John Loveland, merchant of the ship, to go ashore, and wait on him. When they were come before him, he demanded who they were, and how long they would stay. They told him they were Englishmen, and not to stay above 20 or 30 days, and desired permission to trade in his Majesty's port. His answer was, that the king was glad to hear the English were come into his country, and had demanded him to assist them as they should desire, and had sent a letter to be delivered to none but the captain himself. They were then 12 miles from the seaside, and therefore replied that the captain could not leave his ship to come so far, but if he pleased to go down to the seaside, the captain would wait on him to receive the letter. Whereupon the dissauva desired them to stay that day, and on the morrow he would go with them, which, rather than displease him in so small a matter, they consented to. In the evening the dissauva sent a present to the captain of cattle and fruits, etc., which, being carried all night by the messengers, were delivered to him in the morning, who told him withal that his men were coming down with the dissauva, and desired his company on shore against his coming, having a letter from the king, to deliver into his own hand. The captain, mistrusting nothing, came on shore with his boat, and, sitting under a tamarind tree, waited for the Dissauva. In the meantime the native soldiers privately surrounded him and the 7 men he had with him, and seizing them, carried them to meet the Dissauva, bearing the captain on a hammock on their shoulders. The next day the longboat's crew, not knowing what had happened, came on shore to cut down a tree to make cheeks for the mainmast, and were made prisoners after the same manner, though with more violence, because they were more rough with them, and made resistance. Yet they were not brought to the captain and his company, but quartered in another house in the same town. The Dissauva, having thus gotten 2 boats and 18 men, his next care was to gain the ship, and to that end telling the captain that he and his men were only detained because the king intended to send letters and a present to the English nation by him, desired he would send some men on board his ship to order her to stay, and because the ship was in danger of being fired by the Dutch if she stayed long in the bay, to bring her up the river. The captain did not approve of the advice, but did not dare to own his dislike, so he sent his son with the order, but with a solemn conjuration to return again, which he accordingly did, bringing a letter from the company of the ship, that they would not obey the captain nor any other in this matter, but were resolved to stand on their own defence. This letter satisfied the Dissauva, who thereupon gave the captain leave to write for what he would have brought from the ship, pretending that he had not the king's order to release them, though it would suddenly come. The captain, seeing he was held in suspense, and the season of the year spending for the ship to proceed on her voyage to some place, sent order to Mr. John Burford, the chief mate, to take charge of the ship, and set sail to Porto Novo, from whence they came, and there to follow the agent's order. And now began that long and sad captivity they all along feared. The ship being gone, the Dissauva was called up to the king, and they were kept under guards a while, till a special order came from the king to part them, and put one in a town for the convenience of their maintenance, which the king ordered to be at the charge of the country. On September 16, 1660, the captain and his son were placed in a town called Bandar Caswat, in the country of Hatkurli, Herawise Korle, distant from the city of Kandy northward 30 miles, and from the rest of the English a full day's journey. Here they had their provisions brought them twice a day, without money, as much as they could eat, and as good as the country yielded. The situation of the place was very pleasant and commodious, but that year that part of the island was very sickly by agues and fevers, of which many died. The captain and his son, after some time, were visited with the common distemper, and the captain, being also loaded with grief for his deplorable condition, languished more than 3 months, and then died February 9, 1661. Robert Knox, his son, was now left desolate, sick, and in captivity, having none to comfort him but God, who is the Father of the fatherless, and hears the groans of such as are in captivity, being alone to enter upon a long scene of misery and calamity. oppressed with weakness of body and grief of soul for the loss of his father, and the remediless trouble that he was like to endure, and the first instance of it was in the burial of his father, for he sent his black boy to the people of the town to desire their assistance, because they understood not their language, but they sent him only a rope to drag him by the neck into the woods, and told him that they would offer him no other help unless he would pay for it. This barbarous answer increased his trouble for his father's death, that now he was like to lie unburied and be made a prey to the wild beasts in the woods, for the ground was very hard, and they had not tools to dig with, and so it was impossible for them to bury him, and having a small matter of money left him, viz., a pagoda and a gold ring, he hired a man, and so buried him in as decent a manner as their condition would permit. His dead father being removed out of his sight, but his ague continuing, he was reduced very low, partly by sorrow and partly by his disease. All the comfort he had was to go into the woods and fields with a book, either the Practice of Piety or Mr. Rogers' 7 Treatises, which were the only 2 books he had, and meditate and read, and sometimes pray, in which his anguish made him often invert Elijah's petition that he might die, because his life was a burden to him. God, though he was pleased to prolong his life, yet he found a way to lighten his grief by removing his ague, and granting him a desire which above all things was acceptable to him. He had read his 2 books over so often that he had both almost by heart, and though they were both pious and good writings, yet he longed for the truth from the original fountain, and thought it his greatest unhappiness that he had not a Bible, and did believe that he should never see one again. But, contrary to his expectation, God brought him one after this manner. As he was fishing one day with his black boy, to catch some fish to relieve his hunger, an old man passed by them, and asked his boy whether his master could read, and when the boy had answered yes, he told him that he had gotten a book from the Portuguese when they left Colombo, and if his master pleased, he would sell it him. The boy told his master, who bade him go and see what book it was. The boy, having served the English some time, knew the book, and as soon as he got it into his hand, came running to him, calling out before he came to him, "It is the Bible." The words startled him, and he flung down his angle to meet him, and finding it was true, was mightily rejoiced to see it, but he was afraid he should not have enough to purchase it, though he was resolved to part with all the money he had, which was but 1 pagoda, to buy it. But his black boy persuading him to slight it, and leave it to him to buy it, he at length obtained it for a knit cap. This accident he could not but look upon as a great miracle, that God should bestow upon him such an extraordinary blessing, and bring him a Bible in his own native language in such a remote part of the world, where his name was not known, and where it was never heard of that an Englishman had ever been before. The enjoyment of this mercy was a great comfort to him in captivity, and though he wanted no bodily convenience that the country did afford, For the king, immediately after his father's death, had sent an express order to the people of the towns that they should be kind to him and give him good victuals, and after he had been some time in the country and understood the language, he got him good conveniences, as a house and gardens, and falling to husbandry, God so prospered him that he had plenty not only for himself, but to lend others, which being, according to the custom of the country, at 50 per cent a year, much enriched him. He had also goats, which served him for mutton, and hogs and hens. Notwithstanding this, I say, for he lived as fine as any of their noblemen, he could not so far forget his native country as to be contented to dwell in a strange land, where there was to him a famine of God's word and sacraments, the want of which made all other things to be of little value to him. Therefore, as he made it his daily and fervent prayer to God, in his good time, to restore him to both, so at length he, with one Stephen Rutland, who had lived with him 2 years before, resolved to make their escape, and, about the year 1673, meditated all secret ways to compass it. They had before taken up a way of peddling about the country, and buying tobacco, pepper, garlic, combs, and all sorts of ironware, and carried them into those parts of the country where they wanted them. And now, to promote their design, as they went with their commodities from place to place, they discoursed with the country people, for they could now speak their language well, concerning the ways and inhabitants, where the isle was thinnest and fullest inhabited, where and how the watches lay from one country to another, and what commodities were proper for them to carry into all parts, pretending that they would furnish themselves with such wares as the respective places wanted. None doubted but what they did was upon the account of trade, because Mr. Knox was so well seated, and could not be supposed to leave such an estate by travelling northward, because that part of the island was least inhabited, and so, furnishing themselves with such wares as were vendible in those parts, they set forth, and steered their course towards the north part of the islands, knowing very little of the ways, which were generally intricate and perplexed, because they have no public roads, but a multitude of little paths from one town to another, and those often changing, and for white men to inquire about the ways was very dangerous, because the people would presently suspect their design. At this time they travelled from Conde Uda as far as the country of Nuwara Kalawia, which is the furthermost part of the king's dominions, and about 3 days' journey from their dwelling. They were very thankful to Providence that they had passed all difficulties so far, but yet they durst not go any further, because they had no wares left to traffic with, and it being the first time they had been absent so long from home, they feared the townsmen would come after them to seek for them, and so they returned home, and went 8 or 10 times into those parts with their wares, till they became well acquainted both with the people and the paths. In these parts Mr. Knox met his black boy, whom he had turned away divers years before. He had now got a wife and children, and was very poor, but being acquainted with these quarters, he not only took directions of him, but agreed with him for a good reward to conduct him and his companions to the Dutch. he gladly undertook it, and a time was appointed between them. But Mr. Knox being disabled by a grievous pain, which seized him on his right side, and held him 5 days that he could not travel, this appointment proved in vain, for though he went as soon as he was well, his guide was gone into another country about his business, and they durst not at that time venture to run away without him. These attempts took up 8 or 9 years, various accidents hindering their designs, but most commonly the dry weather, because they feared in the woods they should be starved with thirst, all the country being in such a condition almost 4 or 5 years together, for lack of rain. On September 22, 1679, they set forth again, furnished with knives and small axes for their defence, because they could carry them privately, and send all sorts of wares to sell as formerly, and all necessary provisions, the moon being 27 days old, that they might have light to run away by, to try what success God Almighty would now give them in seeking their liberty. Their first stage was to Anuradhapura, and in the way to which lay a wilderness called Piracies, full of wild elephants, tigers, and bears, and because it is the utmost confines of the king's dominions, there is always a watch kept. In the middle of the way they heard that the governor's officers of these parts were out to gather up the king's revenues and duties, to send them up to the city, which put them into no small fear, lest, finding them, they should send them back again. Whereupon they withdrew to the western parts of Ekpolpat, and sat down to knitting till they heard the officers were gone. As soon as they were departed, they went onwards of their journey, having got a good parcel of cotton yarn to knit caps with, and having kept their wares, as they pretended, to exchange for dried flesh, which was sold only in those lower parts. Their way lay necessarily through the governor's yard at Kaluvia, who dwells there on purpose to examine all that go and come. This greatly distressed them, because he would easily suspect they were out of their bounds, being captives. However, they went resolutely to his house, and, meeting him, presented him with a small parcel of tobacco and betel, and showing him their wares, told him they came to get dried flesh to carry back with them. The governor did not suspect them, but told them he was sorry they came in so dry a time, when no deer were to be catched, but if some rain fell, he would soon supply them. This answer pleased them, and they seemed contented to stay, and accordingly, abiding with him 2 or 3 days, and no rain falling, they presented the governor with 5 or 6 charges of gunpowder, which is a rarity among them, and, leaving a bundle at his house, they desired him to shoot them some deer, while they made a step to Anuradhapura. Here also they were put into a great fright by the coming of certain soldiers from the king to the governor, to give him orders to set a secure guard at the watches, that no suspicious persons might pass, which, though it was only intended to prevent the flight of the relations of certain nobles whom the king had clapped up, yet they feared they might wonder to see white men here, and so send them back again. But God so ordered it that they were very kind to them, and left them to their business, and so they got safe to Anuradhapura. Their pretence was dried flesh, though they knew there was none to be had. But their real business was to search the way down to the Dutch, which they stayed 3 days to do. But finding that in the way to Jaffnapatam, which is one of the Dutch ports, there was a watch which could hardly be passed, and other inconveniences not surmountable, they resolved to go back and take the river Malwataoya, which they had before judged would be a profitable guide to lead them to the sea, and that they might not be pursued, left Anuradhapura just at night, when the people never travel for fear of wild beasts, and on Sunday, October 12, being stored with all things needful for their journey, viz., 10 days' provision, a basin to boil their provision in, 2 calabashes to fetch water in, and 2 great talipot leaves for tents, with jaggery, sweetmeats, tobacco, betel, tinder boxes, and a deerskin for shoes, to keep their feet from thorns, because to them they chiefly trusted. Being come to the river, they struck into the woods, and kept by the side of it, yet not going on the sand, lest their footprints should be discerned, unless forced, and then going backwards. Being gotten a good way into the wood, it began to rain, and wherefore they erected their tents, made a fire, and refreshed themselves against the rising of the moon, which was then 18 days old, and having tied deerskins about their feet, and eased themselves of their wares, they proceeded on their journey. When they had travelled 3 or 4 hours, with difficulty, because the moon gave but little light among the thick trees, they found an elephant in their way before them, and because they could not scare him away, they were forced to stay till morning, and so they kindled a fire, and took a pipe of tobacco. By the light they could not discern that ever anybody had been there, nothing being to be seen but woods, and so they were in great hopes that they were past all danger, being beyond all inhabitants. But they were mistaken, for the river winding northward brought them into the midst of a parcel of towns called Tisea-Wava, where, being in danger of being seen, they were under a mighty terror, for had the people found them, they would have beat them and sent them up to the king, and to avoid it, they crept into a hollow tree, and sat there in mud and wet till it began to grow dark, and then, betaking themselves to their legs, travelled till the darkness of night stopped them. They heard voices behind them, and feared it was somebody in pursuit of them, but at length, discerning it was only an hallooing to keep the wild beasts out of the corn, they pitched their tents by the river, and having boiled rice and roasted meat for their suppers, and satisfied their hunger, they committed themselves to God's keeping, and laid them down to sleep. The next morning, to prevent the worst, they got up early and hastened on their journey, and though they were now out of all danger of the tame chiangules, they were in great danger of the wild ones, of whom those woods were full, and though they saw their tents, yet they were all gone, since the rains had fallen from the river into the woods, and so God kept them from that danger, for had they met the wild men, they had been shot. Thus they travelled from morning till night several days, through bushes and thorns, which made their arms and shoulders, which were naked, all of a gore blood. They often met with bears, hogs, deers, and wild buffaloes, but they all ran away as soon as they saw them. The river was exceedingly full of alligators, and in the evening they used to pitch their tents and make great fires both before and behind them to affright the wild beasts, and though they heard the voices of all sorts, they saw none. On Thursday at noon they crossed the river Corunda, Canadera, Oya, which parts the country of the Malabars from the Kings, and on Friday, about 9 or 10 in the morning, came among the inhabitants, of whom they were as much afraid as of the Chiangules before. For though the Waniunai, or prince of this people, payeth tribute to the Dutch out of fear, yet he is better affected to the King of Kandy, and if he had took them, would have sent them up to their old master, but not knowing any way to escape, they kept on their journey by the river side by day, because the woods were not to be travelled by night for thorns and wild beasts, who came down then to the river to drink. In all the Malabar country they met with only 2 Brahmins, who treated them very civilly, and for their money one of them conducted them till they came into the territories of the Dutch, and out of all danger of the King of Kandy, which did not a little rejoice them, but yet they were in no small trouble how to find the way out of the woods, till a Malabar, for the lucre of a knife, conducted them to a Dutch town, where they found guides to conduct them from town to town, till they came to the fort called Aripo, where they arrived Saturday, October 18, 1679, and there thankfully adored God's wonderful providence in thus completing their deliverance from a long captivity of 19 years and 6 months. Section 27 of Captain Singleton. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. The Life, Adventures, and Piracies of Captain Singleton by Daniel Defoe. Section 27. I come now back to my own history, which grows near a conclusion, as to the travels I took in this part of the world. We were now at sea, and we stood away to the north for a while, to try if we could get a market for our spice, for we were very rich in nutmegs, but we ill knew what to do with them. We durst not go upon the English coast, or, to speak more properly, among the English factories to trade, not that we were afraid to fight any 2 ships they had, and besides that, we knew that, as they had no letters of marque or of reprisals from the government, so it was none of their business to act offensively. No, not though we were pirates. Indeed, if we had made any attempt upon them, they might have justified themselves in joining together to resist, and assisting one another to defend themselves, but to go out of their business to attack a pirate ship of almost 50 guns, as we were, it was plain that was none of their business, and consequently it was none of our concern. So we did not trouble ourselves about it. But, on the other hand, it was none of our business to be seen among them, and to have the news of us carried from one factory to another, so that whatever design we might be upon at another time, we should be sure to be prevented and discovered. Much less had we any occasion to be seen among any of the Dutch factories along the coast of Malabar, for, being fully laden with the spices which we had, in the sense of their trade, plundered them of, it would have told them what we were, and all that we had been doing, and they would no doubt have concerned themselves all manner of ways to have fallen upon us. The only way we had for it was to stand away for Goa, and trade, if we could, for our spices with the Portuguese factory there. Accordingly, we sailed almost thither, for we had made land 2 days before, and being in the latitude of Goa, were standing in fair for Margaon, on the head of Salsette, at the going up to Goa, when I called to the men at the helm to bring the ship to, and bid the pilot go away north-northwest till we came out of sight of the shore, when William and I called a council, as we used to do upon emergencies, what course we should take to trade there, and not be discovered; and we concluded at length that we would not go thither at all, but that William, with such trusty fellows only as could be depended upon, should go in the sloop to Surat, which was still farther northward, and trade there as merchants with such of the English factory as they could find to be for their turn. To carry this with the more caution, and so as not to be suspected, we agreed to take out all her guns, and to put such men into her, and no other, as would promise us not to desire or offer to go on shore, or to enter into any talk or conversation with any that might come on board. And, to finish the disguise to our mind, William documented 2 of our men, one a surgeon, as he himself was, and the other a ready-witted fellow, an old sailor, that had been a pilot upon the coast of New England, and was an excellent mimic. These 2 William dressed up like 2 Quakers, and made them talk like such. The old pilot he made go captain of the sloop, and the surgeon for doctor, as he was, and himself supercargo. In this figure, and the sloop all plain, no curled work upon her, indeed she had not much before, and no guns to be seen, away he went for Surat. I should indeed have observed that we went, some days before we parted, to a small sandy island close under the shore, where there was a good cove of deep water, like a road, and out of sight of any of the factories, which are here very thick upon the coast. Here we shifted the loading of the sloop, and put into her such other things only as we had a mind to dispose of there, which was indeed little but nutmegs and cloves, but chiefly the former. And from thence William and his 2 Quakers, with about 18 men in the sloop, went away to Surat, and came to an anchor at a distance from the factory. William used such caution that he found means to go on shore himself, and the doctor, as he called him, in a boat which came on board them to sell fish, rode with only Indians of the country, which boat he afterwards hired to carry him on board again. It was not long that they were on shore, but that they found means to get acquaintance with some Englishmen, who, though they lived there, and perhaps were the company's servants at first, yet appeared then to be traders for themselves, in whatever coast business especially came in their way, and the doctor was made the first to pick acquaintance, so he recommended his friend, the supercargo, till, by degrees, the merchants were as fond of the bargain as our men were of the merchants, only that the cargo was a little too much for them. However, this did not prove a difficulty long with them, For the next day they brought 2 more merchants, English also, into their bargain, and as William could perceive by their discourse, they resolved, if they bought them, to carry them to the Gulf of Persia upon their own accounts. William took the hint, and, as he told me afterwards, concluded we might carry them there as well as they. But this was not William's present business. He had here no less than 33 tons of nuts and 18 tons of cloves. There was a good quantity of mace among the nutmegs, but we did not stand to make much allowance. In short, they bargained, and the merchants, who would gladly have bought sloop and all, gave William directions, and 2 men for pilots, to go to a creek about 6 leagues from the factory, where they brought boats, and unloaded the whole cargo, and paid William very honestly for it, the whole parcel amounting, in money, to about 35,000 pieces of 8, besides some goods of value, which William was content to take, and 2 large diamonds, worth about 300 pounds sterling. When they paid the money, William invited them on board the sloop, where they came, and the merry old Quaker diverted them exceedingly with his talk, and thee'd them and thou'd them till he made them so drunk that they could not go on shore for that night. They would fain have known who our people were and whence they came, but not a man in the sloop would answer them to any question they asked, but in such a manner as to let them think themselves bantered and jested with. However, in discourse, William said they were able men for any cargo we could have brought them, and that they would have bought twice as much spice if we had had it. He ordered the merry captain to tell them that they had another sloop that lay at Margaillon, and that had a great quantity of spice on board also, and that if it was not sold when he went back, for that thither he was bound, he would bring her up. Their new chaps were so eager that they would have bargained with the old captain beforehand. "Nay, friend," said he, "I will not trade with thee unsight and unseen, neither do I know whether the master of the sloop may not have sold his loading already to some merchants of Salsat. But if he has not, when I come to him, I think to bring him up to thee." The doctor had his employment all this while, as well as William and the old captain, for he went on shore several times a day in the Indian boat, and brought fresh provisions for the sloop, which the men had need enough of. He brought, in particular, 17 large casks of arrack, as big as butts, besides smaller quantities, a quantity of rice, and abundance of fruits, mangoes, pompions, and such things, with fowls and fish. He never came on board but he was deep laden, for, in short, he bought for the ship as well as for themselves, and particularly they half loaded the ship with rice and arrack, with some hogs and 6 or 7 cows alive, and thus, being well victualled and having directions for coming again, they returned to us. William was always the lucky welcome messenger to us, but never more welcome to us than now, for where we had thrust in the ship we could get nothing except a few mangoes and roots, being not willing to make any steps into the country, or make ourselves known till we had news of our sloop, and indeed our men's patience was almost tired, for it was 17 days that William spent upon this enterprise, and well bestowed too. When he came back, we had another conference upon the subject of trade, namely, whether we should send the best of our spices and other goods we had in the ship to Surat, or whether we should go up to the Gulf of Persia ourselves, where it was probable we might sell them as well as the English merchants of Surat. William was for going ourselves, which, by the way, was from the good, frugal, merchant-like temper of the man, who was for the best of everything. But here I overruled William, which I very seldom took upon me to do. But I told him that, considering our circumstances, it was much better for us to sell all our cargoes here, though we made but half price of them, than to go with them to the Gulf of Persia, where we should run a greater risk, and where people would be much more curious and inquisitive into things than they were here, and where it would not be so easy to manage them, seeing they traded freely and openly there, not by stealth, as those men seemed to do. And besides, if they suspected anything, it would be much more difficult for us to retreat, except by mere force, than here, where we were upon the high sea, as it were, and could be gone whenever we pleased, without any disguise, or, indeed, without the least appearance of being pursued, none knowing where to look for us. My apprehensions prevailed with William, whether my reasons did or no, and he submitted, and we resolved to try another ship's loading to the same merchants. The main business was to consider how to get off that circumstance that had exposed them to the English merchants, namely, that it was our other sloop. But this the old Quaker pilot undertook, for being, as I said, an excellent mimic himself, it was the easier for him to dress up the sloop in new clothes, and first he put on all the carved work he had taken off before. Her stern, which was painted of a dumb white or dun colour before, all flat, was now all lacquered and blue, and I know not how many gay figures in it. As to her quarter, the carpenters made her a neat little gallery on either side. She had 12 guns put into her, and some petereros upon her gunwale, none of which were there before. And to finish her new habit or appearance, and make her change complete, he ordered her sails to be altered. And as she sailed before with a half sprit, like a yacht, she sailed now with square sail and mizzenmast, like a ketch, so that, in a word, she was a perfect cheat, disguised in everything that a stranger could be supposed to take any notice of, that had never had but one view, for they had been but once on board. In this mean figure the sloop returned. She had a new man put into her for captain, one we knew how to trust, and the old pilot appearing only as a passenger, the doctor and William acting as the supercargoes, by a formal procuration from one Captain Singleton, and all things ordered in form. We had a complete loading for the sloop, for, besides a very great quantity of nutmegs and cloves, mace, and some cinnamon, she had on board some goods which we took in as we lay about the Philippine Islands, while we waited as looking for purchase. William made no difficulty of selling this cargo also, and in about 20 days returned again, freighted with all necessary provisions for our voyage, and for a long time, and, as I say, we had a great deal of other goods. He brought us back about 33,000 pieces of eight, and some diamonds, which, though William did not pretend to much skill in, yet he made shift to act so as not to be imposed upon, the merchants he had to deal with, too, being very fair men. They had no difficulty at all with these merchants, for the prospect they had of gain made them not at all inquisitive, nor did they make the least discovery of the sloop. And as to the selling them spices, which were fetched so far from thence, it seems it was not so much a novelty there as we believed, for the Portuguese had frequently vessels which came from Macao in China, who brought spices, which they bought of the Chinese traders, who again frequently dealt among the Dutch Spice Islands, and received spices in exchange for such goods as they carried from China. This might be called, indeed, the only trading voyage we had made, and now we were really very rich, and it came now naturally before us to consider whither we should go next. Our proper delivery port, as we ought to have called it, was at Madagascar, in the Bay of Mangahelly. But William took me by myself into the cabin of the sloop one day, and told me he wanted to talk seriously with me a little. So we shut ourselves in, and William began with me. "Wilt thou give me leave," says William, "to talk plainly with thee upon thy present circumstances, and thy future prospect of living, and wilt thou promise, on thy word, to take nothing ill of me?" "With all my heart," said I. "William, I have always found your advice good, and your designs have not only been well laid, but your counsel has been very lucky to us, and therefore say what you will, I promise you I will not take it ill." "But that is not all my demand," says William. "If thou dost not like what I am going to propose to thee, thou shalt promise me not to make it public among the men." "I will not, William," says I, "upon my word," and swore to him too, very heartily. "Why then," says William, "I have but one thing more to article with thee about, and that is, that thou wilt consent that, if thou dost not approve of it for thyself, thou wilt yet consent that I shall put so much of it in practice as relates to myself and my new comrade doctor, so that it be nothing to thy detriment and loss." "In anything," says I, "William, but leaving me, I will, but I cannot part with you, upon any terms whatever." "Well," says William, "I am not designing to part from thee, unless it is thy own doing, but assure me in all these points, and I will tell my mind freely." So I promised him everything he desired of me in the solemnest manner possible, and so seriously and frankly withal, that made William no scruple to open his mind to me. "Why then, in the first place," says William, "shall I ask thee if thou dost not think thou and all thy men are rich enough, and have really gotten as much wealth together, by whatsoever way it has been gotten, that is not the question, as we all know what to do with?" "Why, truly, William," said I, "thou art pretty right. I think we have had pretty good luck." "Well then," says William, "I would ask whether, if thou hast gotten enough, thou hast any thought of leaving off this trade, for most people leave off trading when they are satisfied of getting and are rich enough, for nobody trades for the sake of trading, much less do men rob for the sake of thieving." "Well, William," says I, "now I perceive what it is thou art driving at. I warrant you," says I, "you begin to hanker after home." "Why, truly," says William, "thou hast said it, and so I hope thou dost too. It is natural for most men that are abroad to desire to come home again at last, especially when they are grown rich, and when they are, as thou ownest thyself to be, rich enough, and so rich as they know not what to do with more, if they had it. Well, William, said I, but now you think you have laid your preliminary at first, so home that I should have nothing to say. That is, that when I had got money enough, it would be natural to think of going home. But you have not explained what you mean by home, and there you and I shall differ. Why, man, I am at home. Here is my habitation. I never had any other in my lifetime. I was a kind of charity schoolboy, so that I can have no desire of going anywhere, for being rich or poor, for I have nowhere to go. Why, says William, looking a little confused, art not thou an Englishman? Yes, says I think so. You see, I speak English, but I came out of England a child, and never was in it but once since I was a man, and then I was cheated and imposed upon, and used so ill that I care not if I never see it more. Why, hast thou no relations or friends there? Says he. No acquaintance? None that thou hast any kindness or any remains of respect for? Not I, William, said I. No more than I have in the court of the Giat Mogul. Nor any kindness for the country where thou wast born, says William. Not I, any more than for the island of Madagascar, nor so much neither, for that has been a fortunate island to me more than once, as thou knowest, William, says I. William was quite stunned at my discourse, and held his peace, and I said to him, Go on, William, what hast thou to say farther? For I hear you have some project in your head, says I. Come, let's have it out. Nay, says William, thou hast put me to silence, and all I had to say is overthrown. All my projects are come to nothing, and gone. Well, but, William, said I, let me hear what they were, for though it is so that what I have to aim at does not look your way, and though I have no relation, no friend, no acquaintance in England, yet I do not say I like this roving, cruising life so well as never to give it over. Let me hear if thou canst propose to me anything beyond it. Certainly, friend, says William, very gravely. There is something beyond it, and lifting up his hands, he seemed very much affected, and I thought I saw tears stand in his eyes. But I, that was too hardened a wretch to be moved with these things, laughed at him. What, says I, you mean death, I warrant you, don't you? That is beyond this trade. Why, when it comes, then we are all provided for. Ay, says William, that is true, but it would be better that some things were thought on before that came. Thought on, says I. What signifies thinking of it? To think of death is to die, and to be always thinking of it is to be all one's life long a-dying. It is time enough to think of it when it comes. You will easily believe I was well qualified for a pirate that could talk thus. But let me leave it upon record, for the remark of other hardened rogues like myself. My conscience gave me a pang that I never felt before when I said, what signifies thinking of it? And told me I should one day think of these words with a sad heart. But the time of my reflection was not yet come. So I went on. Says William very seriously, I must tell thee, friend, I am sorry to hear thee talk so. They that never think of dying often die without thinking of it. I carried on the jesting way a while farther, and said, Prithee, do not talk of dying. How do we know we shall ever die? And began to laugh. I need not answer thee to that, says William. It is not my place to reprove thee, who art commander over me here, but I would rather thou wouldst talk otherwise of death. It is a coarse thing. Say anything to me, William, said I will take it kindly. I began now to be very much moved at his discourse. Says William, tears running down his face, It is because men live as if they were never to die, that so many die before they know how to live. But it was not death that I meant when I said that there was something to be thought of beyond this way of living. Why, William, said I, what was that? It was repentance, says he. Why, says I, did you ever know a pirate repent? At this he startled a little, and returned, At the gallows I have known one before, and I hope thou wilt be the second. He spoke this very affectionately, with an appearance of concern for me. Well, William, says I, thank you. I am not so senseless of these things, perhaps, as I make myself seem to be. But come, let me hear your proposal. My proposal, says William, is for thy good as well as my own. We may put an end to this kind of life, and repent, and I think the fairest occasion offers for both at this very time that ever did, or ever will, or indeed can happen again. Look you, William, says I, let me have your proposal for putting an end to our present way of living first, for that is the case before us, and you and I will talk of the other afterwards. I am not so insensible, said I, as you may think me to be, but let us get out of this hellish condition we are in first. Nay, says William, thou art in the right there. We must never talk of repenting while we continue pirates. Well, says I, William, that's what I meant, for if we must not reform, as well as be sorry for what is done, I have no notion what repentance means. Indeed, at best, I know little of the matter, but the nature of the thing seems to tell me that the first step we have to take is to break off this wretched course, and I'll begin there with you, with all my heart. I could see by his countenance that William was thoroughly pleased with the offer, and if he had tears in his eyes before, he had more now, but it was from quite a different passion, for he was so swallowed up with joy he could not speak. Come, William, says I, thou showest me plain enough thou hast an honest meaning. Dost thou think it practicable for us to put an end to our unhappy way of living here, and get off? Yes, says he, I think it very practicable for me. Whether it is for thee or no, that will depend on thyself. Well, says I I give you my word that, as I have commanded you all along, from the time I first took you on board, so you shall command me from this hour, and everything you direct me, I'll do." "Wilt thou leave it all to me? Dost thou say this freely?" "Yes, William," said I, "freely, and I'll perform it faithfully." "Why then," says William, "my scheme is this. We are now at the mouth of the Gulf of Persia. We have sold so much of our cargo here at Surat that we have money enough. Send me away for Bassorah with the sloop, laden with the China goods we have on board, which will make another good cargo, and I'll warrant thee I'll find means among the English and Dutch merchants there to lodge a quantity of goods and money also as a merchant, so as we will be able to have recourse to it again upon any occasion, and when I come home we will contrive the rest, and in the meantime do you bring the ship's crew to take a resolution to go to Madagascar as soon as I return." I told him I thought he need not go so far as Bassorah, but might run to Gumbrun or to Ormuz and pretend the same business. "No," says he, "I cannot act with the same freedom there, because the company's factories are there, and I might be laid hold of there on pretence of interloping." "Well, but," said I, "you may go to Ormuz then, for I am loath to part with you so long as to go to the bottom of the Persian Gulf." He returned that I should leave it to him to do as he should see cause. We had taken a large sum of money at Surat, so that we had near 100,000 pounds in money at our command, but on board the great ship we had still a great deal more. I ordered him publicly to keep the money on board which he had, and to buy up with it a quantity of ammunition, if he could get it, and so to furnish us for new exploits, and in the meantime I resolved to get a quantity of gold and some jewels which I had on board the great ship, and place them so that I might carry them off without notice as soon as he came back. And so, according to William's directions, I left him to go the voyage, and I went on board the great ship, in which we had indeed an immense treasure. We waited no less than 2 months for William's return, and indeed I began to be very uneasy about William, sometimes thinking he had abandoned me, and that he might have used the same artifice to have engaged the other men to comply with him, and so they were gone away together, and it was but 3 days before his return that I was just upon the point of resolving to go away to Madagascar and give him over, but the old surgeon, who mimicked the Quaker and passed for the master of the sloop at Surat, persuaded me against that, for which good advice and apparent faithfulness in what he had been trusted with, I made him a party to my design, and he proved very honest. At length William came back, to our inexpressible joy, and brought a great many things with him, as particularly he brought 60 barrels of powder, some iron shot, and about 30 ton of lead. Also he brought a great deal of provisions, and, in a word, William gave me a public account of his voyage in the hearing of whoever happened to be upon the quarter-deck, that no suspicions might be found about us. After all was done, William moved that he might go up again, and that I would go with him, named several things which he had on board that he could not sell there, and particularly told us he had been obliged to leave several things there, the caravans being not come in, and that he had engaged to come back again with goods. This was what I wanted. The men were eager for his going, and particularly because he told them they might load the sloop back with rice and provisions. But I seemed backward to going, when the old surgeon stood up and persuaded me to go, and with many arguments pressed me to it, as particularly if I did not go, there would be no order, and several of the men might drop away, and perhaps betray all the rest, and that they should not think it safe for the sloop to go again, if I did not go, and to urge me to it, he offered himself to go with me. Upon these considerations I seemed to be over persuaded to go, and all the company seemed to be better satisfied when I had consented, and accordingly we took all the powder, lead, and iron out of the sloop into the great ship, and all the other things that were for the ship's use, and put in some bales of spices, and casks or frails of cloves, in all about 7 ton, and some other goods, among the bales of which I had conveyed all my private treasure, which, I assure you, was of no small value, and away I went. At going off, I called a council of all the officers in the ship to consider in what place they should wait for me, and how long, and we appointed the ship to stay 28 days at a little island on the Arabian side of the Gulf, and that if the sloop did not come in that time, they should sail to another island to the west of that place, and wait there 15 days more, and that then, if the sloop did not come, they should conclude some accident must have happened, and the rendezvous should be at Madagascar. Being thus resolved, we left the ship, which both William and I and the surgeon never intended to see any more. We steered directly for the Gulf, and through to Bassorah, or Balsara. This city of Balsara lies at some distance from the place where our sloop lay, and the river not being very safe, and we but ill acquainted with it, having but an ordinary pilot, we went on shore at a village where some merchants live, and which is very populous, for the sake of small vessels riding there. Here we stayed and traded 3 or 4 days, landing all our bales and spices, and indeed the whole cargo that was of any considerable value, which we chose to do rather than go up immediately to Balsara till the project we had laid was put in execution. After we had bought several goods, and were preparing to buy several others, the boat being on shore with 12 men, myself, William, the surgeon, and 1 4th man, whom we had singled out, we contrived to send a Turk just at the dusk of the evening with a letter to the boatswain, and giving the fellow a charge to run with all possible speed, we stood at a small distance to observe the event. The contents of the letter were thus written by the old doctor: Boatswain Thomas, we are all betrayed. For God's sake make off with the boat and get on board, or you are all lost. The captain, William the Quaker, and George the Reformad are seized and carried away. I am escaped and hid, but cannot stir out. If I do, I am a dead man. As soon as you are on board, cut or slip, and make sail for your lives. Adieu. R.S. We stood undiscovered, as above, it being the dusk of the evening, and saw the Turk deliver the letter, and in 3 minutes we saw all the men hurry into the boat and put off, and no sooner were they on board than they took the hint, as we supposed, for the next morning they were out of sight, and we never heard tale or tidings of them since. End of section 27. Section 28 of Captain Singleton. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Dennis Sayers. The Life, Adventures, and Piracies of Captain Singleton by Daniel Defoe. Section 28. We were now in a good place and in very good circumstances, for we passed for merchants of Persia. It is not material to record here what a mass of ill-gotten wealth we had got together. It will be more to the purpose to tell you that I began to be sensible of the crime of getting of it in such a manner as I had done, that I had very little satisfaction in the possession of it, and, as I told William, I had no expectation of keeping it, nor much desire. But as I said to him one day walking out into the fields near the town of Bassorah, so I depended upon it that it would be the case, which you will hear presently. We were perfectly secured at Bassorah, by having frighted away the rogues, our comrades, and we had nothing to do but to consider how to convert our treasure into things proper to make us look like merchants, as we were now to be, and not like freebooters, as we really had been. We happened very opportunely here upon a Dutchman who had travelled from Bengal to Agra, the capital city of the Great Mogul, and from thence was come to the coast of Malabar by land, and got shipping somehow or other up the Gulf, and we found his design was to go up the great river to Baghdad or Babylon, and so by the caravan to Aleppo and Scanderoon. As William spoke Dutch, and was of an agreeable, insinuating behaviour, he soon got acquainted with this Dutchman, and discovering our circumstances to one another, we found he had considerable effects with him, and that he had traded long in that country, and was making homeward to his own country, and that he had servants with him, one an Armenian, whom he had taught to speak Dutch, and who had something of his own, but had a mind to travel into Europe, and the other a Dutch sailor, whom he had picked up by his fancy, and reposed a great trust in him, and a very honest fellow he was. This Dutchman was very glad of an acquaintance, because he soon found that we directed our thoughts to Europe also, and as he found we were encumbered with goods only, for we let him know nothing of our money, he readily offered us his assistance to dispose of as many of them as the place we were in would put off, and his advice what to do with the rest. While this was doing, William and I consulted what to do with ourselves and what we had, and first we resolved we would never talk seriously of our measures but in the open fields, where we were sure nobody could hear. So every evening, when the sun began to decline and the air to be moderate, we walked out, sometimes this way, sometimes that, to consult of our affairs. I should have observed that we had new clothed ourselves here, after the Persian manner, with long vests of silk, a gown or robe of English crimson cloth, very fine and handsome, and had let our beards grow, so after the Persian manner, that we passed for Persian merchants, in view only, though, by the way, we could not understand or speak one word of the language of Persia, or indeed of any other but English and Dutch, and of the latter I understood very little. However, the Dutchmen supplied all this for us, and as we had resolved to keep ourselves as retired as we could, though there were several English merchants upon the place, yet we never acquainted ourselves with one of them, or exchanged a word with them, by which means we prevented their inquiry of us now, or their giving any intelligence of us, if any news of our landing here should happen to come, which it was easy for us to know was possible enough if any of our comrades fell into bad hands, or by many accidents which we could not foresee. It was during my being here, for here we stayed near 2 months, that I grew very thoughtful about my circumstances, not as to the danger, neither indeed were we in any, but were entirely concealed and unsuspected, but I really began to have other thoughts of myself and of the world than ever I had before. William had struck so deep into my unthinking temper with hinting to me that there was something beyond all this, that the present time was the time of enjoyment, but that the time of account approached, that the work that remained was gentler than the labour past, viz., repentance, and that it was high time to think of it. I say these and such thoughts as these engrossed my hours, and, in a word, I grew very sad. As to the wealth I had, which was immensely great, it was all like dirt under my feet. I had no value for it, no peace in the possession of it, no great concern about me for the leaving of it. William had perceived my thoughts to be troubled, and my mind heavy and depressed for some time, and one evening, in one of our cool walks, I began with him about the leaving our effects. William was a wise and wary man, and indeed all the prudentials of my conduct had for a long time been owing to his advice, and so now all the methods for preserving our effects, and even ourselves, lay upon him, and he had been telling me of some of the measures he had been taking for our making homeward, and for the security of our wealth, when I took him very short. "Why, William," says I, "dost thou think we shall ever be able to reach Europe with all this cargo that we have about us?" "Ay," says William, "without doubt, as well as other merchants with theirs, as long as it is not publicly known what quantity or of what value our cargo consists." "Why, William," says I, smiling, "do you think that if there is a God above, as you have so long been telling me there is, and that we must give an account to him, I say, do you think if he be a righteous judge, he will let us escape thus with the plunder, as we may call it, of so many innocent people, nay, I might say nations, and not call us to an account for it before we can get to Europe, where we pretend to enjoy it?" William appeared struck and surprised at the question, and made no answer for a great while, and I repeated the question, adding that it was not to be expected. After a little pause, says William, "Thou hast started a very weighty question, and I can make no positive answer to it, but I will state it thus. First, it is true that, if we consider the justice of God, we have no reason to expect any protection. But as the ordinary ways of Providence are out of the common road of human affairs, so we may hope for mercy still upon our repentance, and we know not how good he may be to us. So we are to act as if we rather depended upon the last, I mean the merciful part, than claimed the first, which must produce nothing but judgment and vengeance. But hark ye, William, says I, the nature of repentance, as you have hinted once to me, included reformation, and we can never reform. How, then, can we repent? Why can we never reform? Says William. Because, said I, we cannot restore what we have taken away by rapine and spoil. It is true, says William, we can never do that, for we can never come to the knowledge of the owners. But what then must be done with our wealth? Said I, the effects of plunder and rapine. If we keep it, we continue to be robbers and thieves, and if we quit it, we cannot do justice with it, for we cannot restore it to the right owners. Nay, says William, the answer to it is short. To quit what we have and do it here is to throw it away to those who have no claim to it, and to divest ourselves of it, but to do no right with it, whereas we ought to keep it carefully together, with a resolution to do what right with it we are able, and who knows what opportunity Providence may put into our hands to do justice, at least, to some of those we have injured. So we ought at least to leave it to him and go on. As it is, without doubt our present business is to go to some place of safety, where we may wait his will. The resolution of William was very satisfying to me indeed. The truth is, all he said, and at all times, was solid and good. And had not William thus, as it were, quieted my mind, I think verily I was so alarmed at the just reason I had to expect vengeance from heaven upon me for my ill-gotten wealth, that I should have run away from it as the devil's goods, that I had nothing to do with, that did not belong to me, and that I had no right to keep, and was in danger of being destroyed for. However, William settled my mind to more prudent steps than these, and I concluded that I ought, however, to proceed to a place of safety, and leave the event to God Almighty's mercy. But this I must leave upon record, that I had from this time no joy of the wealth I had got. I looked upon it all as stolen, and so indeed the greatest part of it was. I looked upon it as a hoard of other men's goods, which I had robbed the innocent owners of, and which I ought, in a word, to be hanged for here and damned for hereafter. And now, indeed, I began sincerely to hate myself for a dog, a wretch that had been a thief and a murderer, a wretch that was in a condition which nobody was ever in. For I had robbed, and though I had the wealth by me, yet it was impossible I should ever make any restitution, and upon this account it ran in my head that I could never repent, for that repentance could not be sincere without restitution, and therefore must of necessity be damned. There was no room for me to escape. I went about with my heart full of these thoughts, little better than a distracted fellow; in short, running headlong into the dreadfullest despair, and premeditating nothing but how to rid myself out of the world. And indeed the devil, if such things are of the devil's immediate doing, followed his work very close with me, and nothing lay upon my mind for several days but to shoot myself into the head with my pistol. I was all this while in a vagrant life, among infidels, Turks, pagans, and such sort of people. I had no minister, no Christian to converse with but poor William. He was my ghostly father or confessor, and he was all the comfort I had. As for my knowledge of religion, you have heard my history. You may suppose I had not much, and as for the Word of God, I do not remember that I ever read a chapter in the Bible in my lifetime. I was little Bob at Bustleton, and went to school to learn my Testament. However, it pleased God to make William the Quaker everything to me. Upon this occasion, I took him out one evening, as usual, and hurried him away into the fields with me, in more haste than ordinary, and there, in short, I told him the perplexity of my mind, and under what terrible temptations of the devil I had been, that I must shoot myself, for I could not support the weight and terror that was upon me. "Shoot yourself?" says William. "Why, what will that do for you?" "Why," says I, "it will put an end to a miserable life." "Well," says William, are you satisfied the next will be better?" No, says I, "much worse, to be sure." "Why, then," says he, "shooting yourself is the devil's motion, no doubt, for it is the devil of a reason, that, because thou art in an ill case, therefore thou must put thyself into a worse." This shocked my reason indeed. "Well, but," says I, "there is no bearing the miserable condition I am in." "Very well," says William, "but it seems there is some bearing a worse condition, and so you will shoot yourself, that you may be past remedy." "I am past remedy already," says I. "How do you know that?" says he. "I am satisfied of it," said I. "Well," says he, "but you are not sure, so you will shoot yourself to make it certain. For though on this side death you cannot be sure you will be damned at all, yet the moment you step on the other side of time, you are sure of it. For when it is done, it is not to be said then that you will be, but that you are damned." "Well, but," says William, as if he had been between jest and earnest, "pray, what didst thou dream of last night?" "Why," said I had frightful dreams all night, and particularly I dreamed that the devil came for me, and asked me what my name was, and I told him. Then he asked me what trade I was. "Trade?" says I. "I am a thief, a rogue by my calling. I am a pirate and a murderer, and ought to be hanged." Ay, says the devil, "so you do, and you are the man I looked for, and therefore come along with me." At which I was most horribly frightened, and cried out so that it waked me, and I have been in horrible agony ever since. "Very well," says William. "Come, give me the pistol thou talk'st of just now." "Why," says I, "what will you do with it?" Do with it, says William, why, thou needst not shoot thyself. I shall be obliged to do it for thee. Why, thou wilt destroy us all. What do you mean, William? Mean? Said he. Nay, what didst thou mean? To cry out aloud in thy sleep, I am a thief, a pirate, a murderer, and ought to be hanged. Why, thou wilt ruin us all. 'Twas well the Dutchman did not understand English. In short, I must shoot thee, to save my own life. Come, come, says he, give me thy pistol. I confess this terrified me again another way, and I began to be sensible that, if anybody had been near me to understand English, I had been undone. The thought of shooting myself forsook me from that time, and I turned to William. You disorder me extremely, William, said I. Why, I am never safe, nor is it safe to keep me company. What shall I do? I shall betray you all. Come, come, friend Bob, says he, I'll put an end to it all, if you will take my advice. How's that? Said I. Why, only, says he, that the next time thou talkest with the devil, thou wilt talk a little softlier, or we shall be all undone, and you too. This frighted me, I must confess, and allayed a great deal of the trouble of mind I was in. But William, after he had done jesting with me, entered upon a very long and serious discourse with me about the nature of my circumstances, and about repentance, that it ought to be attended, indeed, with a deep abhorrence of the crime that I had to charge myself with, but that to despair of God's mercy was no part of repentance, but putting myself into the condition of the devil, indeed, that I must apply myself with a sincere, humble confession of my crime, to ask pardon of God, whom I had offended, and cast myself upon his mercy, resolving to be willing to make restitution, if ever it should please God to put it in my power, even to the utmost of what I had in the world. And this, he told me, was the method which he had resolved upon himself, and in this, he told me, he had found comfort. I had a great deal of satisfaction in William's discourse, and it quieted me very much. But William was very anxious ever after about my talking in my sleep, and took care to lie with me always himself, and to keep me from lodging in any house where so much as a word of English was understood. However, there was not the like occasion afterward, for I was much more composed in my mind, and resolved for the future to live a quite different life from what I had done. As to the wealth I had, I looked upon it as nothing. I resolved to set it apart to any such opportunity of doing justice as God should put into my hand, and the miraculous opportunity I had afterwards of applying some parts of it to preserve a ruined family, whom I had plundered, may be worth reading, if I have room for it in this account. With these resolutions I began to be restored to some degree of quiet in my mind, and having, after almost 3 months' stay at Bassorah, disposed of some goods, but having a great quantity left, we hired boats according to the Dutchman's direction, and went up to Baghdad or Babylon, on the river Tigris, or rather Euphrates, We had a very considerable cargo of goods with us, and therefore made a great figure there, and were received with respect. We had, in particular, 42 bales of Indian stuffs of sundry sorts, silks, muslins, and fine chintz. We had 15 bales of very fine China silks, and 70 packs or bales of spices, particularly cloves and nutmegs, with other goods. We were bid money here for our cloves, but the Dutchman advised us not to part with them, and told us we should get a better price at Aleppo, or in the Levant. So we prepared for the caravan. We concealed our having any gold or pearls as much as we could, and therefore sold 3 or 4 bales of China silks and Indian calicoes, to raise money to buy camels, and to pay the customs which are taken at several places, and for our provisions over the deserts. I travelled this journey careless to the last degree of my goods or wealth, believing that, as I came by it all by rapine and violence, God would direct that it should be taken from me again in the same manner. And indeed I think I might say I was very willing it should be so. But as I had a merciful protector above me, so I had a most faithful steward, counselor, partner, or whatever I might call him, who was my guide, my pilot, my governor, my everything, and took care both of me and of all we had. And though he had never been in any of these parts of the world, yet he took the care of all upon him, and in about 59 days we arrived from Bassorah, at the mouth of the river Tigris or Euphrates, through the desert, and through Aleppo to Alexandria, or, as we call it, Scanderoon, in the Levant. Here William and I, and the other 2, our faithful comrades, debated what we should do, and here William and I resolved to separate from the other 2, they resolving to go with the Dutchman into Holland by the means of some Dutch ship which lay then in the road. William and I told them we resolved to go and settle in the Morea, which then belonged to the Venetians. It is true we acted wisely in it not to let them know whither we went, seeing we had resolved to separate, but we took our old doctor's directions how to write to him in Holland and in England, that we might have intelligence from him on occasion, and promised to give him an account how to write to us, which we afterwards did, as may in time be made out. We stayed here some time after they were gone, till at length, not being thoroughly resolved whither to go till then, a Venetian ship touched at Cyprus, and put in at Scanderoon to look for freight home. We took the hint, and bargaining for our passage and the freight of our goods, we embarked for Venice, where in 22 days we arrived safe, with all our treasure, and with such a cargo, take our goods and our money and our jewels together, as, I believed, was never brought into the city by 2 single men, since the state of Venice had a being. We kept ourselves here incognito for a great while, passing for 2 Armenian merchants still, as we had done before. And by this time we had gotten so much of the Persian and Armenian jargon, which they talked at Bassorah and Baghdad, and everywhere that we came in the country, as was sufficient to make us able to talk to one another, so as not to be understood by anybody, though sometimes hardly by ourselves. Here we converted all our effects into money, settled our abode as for a considerable time, and William and I maintaining an inviolable friendship and fidelity to one another, lived like two brothers. We neither had nor sought any separate interest. We conversed seriously and gravely, and upon the subject of our repentance continually. We never changed, that is to say, so as to leave off our Armenian garbs, and we were called at Venice the two Grecians. I had been 2 or 3 times going to give a detail of our wealth, but it will appear incredible, and we had the greatest difficulty in the world how to conceal it, being justly apprehensive lest we might be assassinated in that country for our treasure. At length William told me he began to think now that he must never see England any more, and that indeed he did not much concern himself about it, but seeing as we had gained so great wealth, and he had some poor relations in England, if I was willing, he would write to know if they were living, and to know what condition they were in, and if he found such of them were alive as he had some thoughts about, he would, with my consent, send them something to better their condition. I consented most willingly, and accordingly William wrote to a sister and an uncle, and in about 5 weeks' time received an answer from them both, directed to himself, under cover of a hard Armenian name that he had given himself, viz. Signore Constantine Alexion of Ispahan at Venice. It was a very moving letter he received from his sister, who, after the most passionate expressions of joy to hear he was alive, seeing she had long ago had an account that he was murdered by the pirates in the West Indies, entreats him to let her know what circumstances he was in, tells him she was not in any capacity to do anything considerable for him, but that he should be welcome to her with all her heart, that she was left a widow with 4 children, but kept a little shop in the Minories, by which she made shift to maintain her family, and that she had sent him £5, lest he should want money in a strange country to bring him home. I could see the letter brought tears out of his eyes as he read it, and indeed, when he showed it to me, and the little bill for £5 upon an English merchant in Venice, it brought tears out of my eyes too. After we had been both affected sufficiently with the tenderness and kindness of this letter, he turns to me, says he, "What shall I do for this poor woman?" I mused a while. At last, says I will tell you what you shall do for her. She has sent you £5, and she has 4 children, and herself, that is 5. Such a sum from a poor woman in her circumstances is as much as £5,000 is to us. You shall send her a bill of exchange for £5,000 English money, and bid her conceal her surprise at it till she hears from you again, but bid her leave off her shop, and go and take a house somewhere in the country, not far off from London, and stay there in a moderate figure till she hears from you again. Now, says William, I perceive by it that you have some thoughts of venturing into England. Indeed, William, said I, you mistake me, but it presently occurred to me that you should venture, for what have you done that you may not be seen there? Why should I desire to keep you from your relations, purely to keep me company? William looked very affectionately upon me. Nay, says he, we have embarked together so long, and come together so far, I am resolved I will never part with thee as long as I live. Go where thou wilt, or stay where thou wilt. And as for my sister, says William, I cannot send her such a sum of money, for whose is all this money we have? It is most of it thine. No, William, said I, there is not a penny of it mine, but what is yours too, and I won't have anything but an equal share with you, and therefore you shall send it to her. If not, I will send it. Why, says William, it will make the poor woman distracted. She will be so surprised she will go out of her wits. Well, said I, William, you may do it prudently. Send her a bill packed of 100 pounds, and bid her expect more in a post or two, and that you will send her enough to live on without keeping shop, and then send her more. Accordingly, William sent her a very kind letter, with a bill upon a merchant in London for 160 pounds, and bid her comfort herself with the hope that he should be able in a little time to send her more. About 10 days later he sent her another bill of 540 pounds, and a post or two after another for 300 pounds, making in all 1,000 pounds, and told her he would send her sufficient to leave off her shop, and directed her to take a house as above. He waited then till he received an answer to all the 3 letters, with an account that she had received the money, and, which I did not expect, that she had not let any other acquaintance know that she had received a shilling from anybody, or so much as that he was alive, and would not till she had heard again. When he showed me this letter, Well, William, said I, this woman is fit to be trusted with life or anything. Send her the rest of the 5,000 pounds, and I'll venture to England with you, to this woman's house, whenever you will. In a word, we sent her 5,000 pounds in good bills, and she received them very punctually, and in a little time sent her brother word that she had pretended to her uncle that she was sickly and could not carry on the trade any longer, and that she had taken a large house about 4 miles from London, under pretence of letting lodgings for her livelihood, and, in short, intimated as if she understood that he intended to come over to be incognito, assuring him he should be as retired as he pleased. This was opening the very door for us that we thought had been effectually shut for this life, and, in a word, we resolved to venture, but to keep ourselves entirely concealed, both as to name and every other circumstance. And accordingly William sent his sister word how kindly he took her prudent steps, and that she had guessed right, that he desired to be retired, and that he obliged her not to increase her figure, but live private, till she might perhaps see him. He was going to send the letter away. Come, William, said I, you shan't send her an empty letter. Tell her you have a friend coming with you that must be as retired as yourself, and I'll send her 5,000 pounds more. So, in short, we made this poor woman's family rich, and yet when it came to the point, my heart failed me, and I durst not venture, and for William, he would not stir without me, and so we stayed about 2 years after this, considering what we should do. You may think, perhaps, that I was very prodigal of my ill-gotten goods, thus to load a stranger with my bounty, and give a gift like a prince to one that had been able to merit nothing of me, or indeed know me. But my condition ought to be considered in this case. Though I had money to profusion, yet I was perfectly destitute of a friend in the world, to have the least obligation or assistance from, or knew not either where to dispose or trust anything I had while I lived, or whom to give it to if I died. When I had reflected upon the manner of my getting of it, I was sometimes for giving it all to charitable uses, as a debt due to mankind, though I was no Roman Catholic, and not at all of the opinion that it would purchase me any repose to my soul. But I thought, as it was got by a general plunder, and which I could make no satisfaction for, it was due to the community, and I ought to distribute it for the general good. But still I was at a loss how, and where, and by whom to settle this charity, not daring to go home to my country, lest some of my comrades strolled home should see and detect me, and for the very spoil of my money, or the purchase of his own pardon, betray and expose me to an untimely end. Being thus destitute, I say, of a friend, I pitched thus upon William's sister, the kind step of hers to her brother, whom she thought to be in distress, signifying a generous mind and a charitable disposition, and having resolved to make her the object of my first bounty, I did not doubt but I should purchase something of a refuge for myself, and a kind of a centre to which I should tend in my future actions. For really, a man that has a subsistence, and no residence, no place that has a magnetic influence upon his affections, is in one of the most odd, uneasy conditions in the world, nor is it in the power of all his money to make it up to him. It was, as I told you, 2 years and upwards that we remained at Venice, and thereabout, in the greatest hesitation imaginable, irresolute and unfixed to the last degree. William's sister importuned us daily to come to England, and wondered we should not dare to trust her, whom we had to such a degree obliged to be faithful, and in a manner lamented her being suspected by us. At last I began to incline, and I said to William, "Come, brother William," said I, for ever since our discourse at Bassorah I called him brother, "if you will agree to 2 or 3 things with me, I'll go home to England with all my heart." Says William, "Let me know what they are." "Why, first," says I, "you shall not disclose yourself to any of your relations in England but your sister. No, not one. Secondly, we will not shave off our mustachios or beards, for we had all along worn our beards after the Grecian manner, nor leave off our long vests, that we may pass for Grecians and foreigners. Thirdly, that we shall never speak English in public before anybody, your sister excepted. Fourthly, that we will always live together and pass for brothers." William said he would agree to them all with all his heart, but that the not speaking English would be the hardest, but he would do his best for that too. So, in a word, we agreed to go from Venice to Naples, where we converted a large sum of money into bales of silk, left a large sum in a merchant's hands at Venice, and another considerable sum at Naples, and took bills of exchange for a great deal too. And yet we came with such a cargo to London as few American merchants had done for some years, for we loaded in 2 ships 73 bales of thrown silk, besides 13 bales of wrought silks from the Duchy of Milan, shipped at Genoa, with all which I arrived safely, and some time after I married my faithful protectress, William's sister, with whom I am much more happy than I deserve. And now, having so plainly told you that I am come to England, after I have so boldly owned what life I have led abroad, it is time to leave off, and say no more for the present, lest some should be willing to inquire too nicely after your old friend, Captain Bob. End of section 28, and end of the life, adventures, and piracies of Captain Singleton by Daniel Defoe. Read by Dennis Sayers and Modesto